Throughout history, certain battles didn't just decide wars, they reshaped entire civilizations, redrew borders, and altered the balance of global power. From the disciplined ranks of ancient armies clashing at Marathon, to the relentless industrial warfare of Stalingrad, these were not isolated acts of conflict. They were turning points, where strategy, timing, and human endurance collided under extreme pressure, and where the outcome carried consequences that reached far beyond the battlefield. Each confrontation unfolded with staggering stakes. Empires stood on the edge of expansion or collapse. Commanders made decisions in moments where intelligence was incomplete, and hesitation could cost thousands, or determine the fate of nations. In the smoke and chaos of war, outcomes were decided not just by force, but by endurance, logistics, and the fragile line between order and collapse. And when the fighting ended, the effects did not fade. They spread, through governments, borders, economies, and generations. This is not simply a record of battles. It is an investigation into the moments where history itself was redirected. Battle of Marathon, outnumbered but not defeated. In 490 BC, during the first Persian invasion of Greece, the Athenian city-state and its ally Plataea faced one of the most powerful military forces of the ancient world, the Persian Empire. The Persians had already subdued regions across the Aegean and struck deep into Greek territory, landing at the plain of Marathon with a force that vastly outnumbered the defenders. Athens, forced into immediate mobilization, gathered a citizen army under the command of General Miltiades, knowing that delay would mean collapse. What followed was not a defensive stand behind city walls, but a calculated offensive maneuver on open ground. The Athenians adapted their formation, strengthened their flanks, and engaged the Persian forces before they could fully consolidate their position. In the resulting clash, the Persian center initially pushed forward, but their formation was ultimately encircled and broken under sustained pressure. The outcome was a decisive Greek victory. Persian forces were forced to retreat, marking the first major land defeat of the Achaemenid campaign in Greece. More than a battlefield result, Marathon demonstrated that the Persian military advance into mainland Greece was not invincible, reshaping the strategic expectations of future conflicts between East and West. Battle of Thermopylae. 300 versus an empire. In 480 BC, during the Second Persian invasion of Greece, King Xerxes I advanced with a massive army into the narrow mountain pass of Thermopylae. The objective was clear: break through central Greece and force the Greek city-states into submission. Opposing him was a small Greek coalition force, led by King Leonidas of Sparta. Outnumbered and positioned in a terrain that left no room for retreat, the Greeks chose to hold the pass rather than abandon it. For days, the Persians launched repeated assaults, expecting a quick breakthrough. Instead, they were met with disciplined hoplite formations that neutralized their numerical advantage in the confined terrain. The situation changed only after the Greeks were outflanked through a hidden mountain path, reportedly revealed to the Persians by a local informant. Once encirclement became unavoidable, Leonidas dismissed most of the allied forces, remaining with a small rearguard, including his 300 Spartans, to delay the Persian advance. What followed was a final stand that ended in total destruction of the remaining Greek force, but it succeeded in its strategic purpose. The Persian army was delayed long enough for other Greek city-states to prepare their defenses, shaping the conditions for later resistance across the Aegean. Although a tactical defeat, Thermopylae became one of Antiquity's most enduring examples of calculated sacrifice under overwhelming odds, where delay itself became a form of strategy. Battle of Salamis. See Battle that saved Greece. In 480 BC, during the Second Persian invasion of Greece, King Xerxes I deployed a massive naval force into the Saronic Gulf, aiming to crush the remaining Greek resistance after the fall of Athens. The Greek alliance, smaller in number and under pressure from multiple fronts, was forced to withdraw its fleet into the narrow straits of Salamis. What followed was a calculated confrontation shaped not by open sea dominance, but by geography and controlled engagement. Under the strategic direction of Athenian commander Themistocles, the Greek fleet drew the Persian navy into confined waters between Salamis Island and the mainland. In this restricted space, the numerical advantage of the Persian fleet became a liability, limiting maneuverability and disrupting coordination. The Greek triremes, built for agility and close combat, exploited these conditions. Formations held, ramming tactics were executed at short range, and the Persian lines began to fragment under pressure and congestion. Confusion spread through the larger fleet as ships obstructed one another and command control weakened. The outcome was a decisive Greek victory. Hundreds of Persian vessels were lost, while the Greek fleet sustained significantly fewer casualties. The Persian advance by sea was effectively halted, forcing Xerxes to reconsider the campaign and withdraw a large portion of his forces. The Battle of Salamis marked a critical turning point in the Greco-Persian Wars, where control of terrain, timing, and tactical discipline outweighed sheer numerical superiority, altering the trajectory of the conflict. Battle of Gaugamela. Alexander's defining moment. In 331 BC, Alexander the Great advanced deep into the heart of the Achaemenid Empire to confront King Darius III in what would become the decisive clash for control of Asia. The Persians had chosen the plain of Gaugamela deliberately, wide, open terrain prepared to maximize their numerical advantage, including cavalry, chariots, and a reinforced battle line designed to encircle and overwhelm the Macedonian army. Facing them, Alexander commanded a smaller but highly disciplined force built around the phalanx and elite companion cavalry, fully aware that a direct, static engagement would risk encirclement and collapse. As the battle unfolded, the Persians attempted to stretch the Macedonian line and exploit perceived weaknesses on the flanks. In response, Alexander executed controlled movement with his cavalry, drawing enemy formations outward and gradually creating disruption within the Persian center. This pressure eventually opened a gap in the line near Darius's position. Sensing the break, Alexander launched a concentrated strike toward the exposed center. The Macedonian advance penetrated deep enough to threaten the Persian command structure directly, forcing Darius to withdraw from the battlefield. With the Persian king in retreat, cohesion across his army collapsed, and the larger force began to disintegrate under coordinated Macedonian pursuit. The outcome was decisive. The Persian army was defeated, and the authority of Darius III was irreparably broken. In strategic terms, Gaugamela marked the collapse of Achaemenid power and secured Alexander's control over the Persian Empire, reshaping the political landscape of the ancient world. Battle of Cannae. Rome's worst defeat. In 216 BC, during the Second Punic War, the Roman Republic deployed one of the largest armies in its history to confront Hannibal Barca near the village of Cannae in southern Italy. Confident in their numerical superiority, Roman commanders aimed to crush the Carthaginian invasion in a single decisive engagement. Hannibal, however, had already studied Roman doctrine. Rather than meeting force with force in a conventional line battle, he arranged his army in a deliberately flexible formation on open ground, positioning weaker infantry at the center and stronger, disciplined units on the flanks, supported by highly mobile cavalry. The terrain and positioning were selected with precision, narrowing the battlefield's effective space and limiting Roman maneuverability. As the battle began, Roman legions advanced aggressively into the center, pressing what appeared to be a retreating Carthaginian line. The center gradually gave way under pressure, drawing Roman forces deeper into the formation. At the same time, Hannibal's cavalry secured dominance on both wings, cutting off Roman movement and preventing reinforcement or withdrawal. Once the Roman army was fully committed and compressed into a confined space, the Carthaginian flanks turned inward. What had begun as forward pressure transformed into containment. The Roman formation collapsed into a tightening encirclement, with escape routes cut off on all sides. The outcome was catastrophic for Rome. The army was effectively surrounded and destroyed, suffering one of the largest single-day losses in its military history. While the defeat did not end the war, it exposed critical weaknesses in Roman tactical rigidity and demonstrated the effectiveness of Hannibal's double envelopment strategy, an event still studied as one of the most complete battlefield annihilations of antiquity. Battle of Alesia. Caesar's perfect siege. In 52 BC, during the final phase of the Gallic Wars, Julius Caesar advanced on the fortified hilltop settlement of Alesia, where the Gallic leader Vercingetorix had consolidated a last major resistance against Roman expansion in Gaul. The situation was strategically complex. Inside the oppidum, Vercingetorix and tens of thousands of Gallic warriors were entrenched and running low on supplies. Outside, a massive relief force gathered from across Gaul, aiming to break Caesar's encirclement and reverse the momentum of the war. Caesar now faced a rare dual threat, an enemy trapped within the city, and another converging from the outside. In response, Caesar ordered the construction of an unprecedented double line of fortifications. The inner ring sealed the city, preventing breakout. The outer ring faced outward, designed to absorb and repel the approaching relief army. Roman forces were effectively placed under siege while simultaneously conducting a siege themselves. As the relief forces launched coordinated assaults and the defenders attempted breakout attacks, the Roman lines held under sustained pressure. Despite being outnumbered across the broader battlefield, Caesar's defensive engineering, disciplined legions, and controlled positioning prevented either Gallic force from breaking the encirclement. The outcome was decisive. The relief army collapsed, and the trapped forces inside Alesia were forced into surrender. Vercingetorix was taken prisoner, marking the end of organized Gallic resistance. The victory at Alesia did more than end a campaign, it completed the Roman conquest of Gaul and cemented Caesar's reputation as one of Antiquity's most effective military strategists, capable of turning siege warfare into a decisive instrument of total victory. Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. Rome's expansion stopped cold. In 9 AD, during the early phase of Roman imperial expansion into Germania, 3 Roman legions under the command of Publius Quinctilius Varus were moving through the dense forests of the region, attempting to secure and stabilize recently influenced territories beyond the Rhine. Unknown to them, their guide and trusted auxiliary commander, Arminius, a Germanic leader educated in Roman military systems, had coordinated a large-scale revolt among local tribes. What appeared to be a routine march through unsettled terrain was, in reality, a carefully prepared ambush unfolding across broken woodland, narrow paths, and unstable ground. The Roman column was stretched over several kilometers, slowed by supply wagons, non-combat personnel, and deteriorating weather conditions. In this environment, their core advantage, tight formation discipline, was repeatedly disrupted. Germanic forces struck from elevated positions and concealed routes, using hit-and-run attacks that prevented the legions from forming stable defensive lines. Over several days of continuous engagement, the Roman force was systematically broken apart. Isolated units were overwhelmed, communication collapsed, and attempts to regroup were met with renewed attacks across multiple fronts. The outcome was a total destruction of the Roman expedition. 3 legions were annihilated, and Roman survivors were either captured or scattered, marking one of the most severe military defeats in Roman history. The result halted Roman ambitions to fully incorporate Germania east of the Rhine, effectively establishing a long-term frontier boundary between Roman-controlled territories and the independent Germanic world. Battle of Hastings, 1066. England changed forever. In 1066, following the death of Edward the Confessor, a disputed succession drew 2 rival claimants into direct conflict for the English crown, Harold Godwin's son, recently crowned king in England, and William, Duke of Normandy, who asserted he had been promised the throne. The confrontation culminated near Hastings on October 14, 1066, where William's forces landed on the southern coast of England and advanced toward Harold's position. The English army, largely composed of infantry forming a defensive shield wall on high ground, prepared to resist. Opposing them, the Norman army combined infantry, archers, and cavalry, units coordinated for repeated pressure and controlled attacks rather than a single decisive charge. As the battle developed, the Norman assaults tested the integrity of the English defensive line. Fighting continued throughout the day, with shifts in momentum as both sides absorbed heavy losses. Norman forces repeatedly engaged and withdrew under tactical control, gradually drawing sections of the English line out of formation. The turning point came as the English defensive structure weakened under sustained pressure and fragmentation. Harold's position collapsed during the final phase of combat, and the remaining English forces were overwhelmed. The outcome was a decisive Norman victory. Harold was killed, and resistance disintegrated soon after. William secured the English throne, later crowned as king, marking the beginning of Norman rule and a profound transformation of England's political structure, aristocracy, and cultural direction. Battle of Agincourt. Longbows changed everything. In 1415, during the 100 Years' War, King Henry V of England led an exhausted army deep into northern France, attempting to retreat toward Calais after the siege of Harfleur. Blocking his path was a far larger French force, assembled to intercept and destroy the weakened English army. The French command expected a decisive victory. On open ground, with superior numbers and heavily armored knights, they intended to overwhelm the English before they could reach safety. The battlefield near Agincourt, however, had been narrowed by woodland and recent rain, turning the terrain into thick, restrictive mud that limited cavalry movement and disrupted coordinated attacks. As the battle began, French forces advanced in dense formations across the muddy field, struggling under the weight of armor and the pressure of compression at the front lines. In response, English longbowmen unleashed sustained volleys from protected positions, reducing momentum before close combat even began. Repeated charges collapsed into confusion as units became tightly packed and difficult to control. What followed was a breakdown of the French offensive structure. Attacks that were meant to break the English line instead fed into narrowing kill zones, where movement and command coordination became increasingly impossible. The English force, though significantly smaller, maintained cohesion throughout the engagement. The outcome was a decisive English victory. The French army suffered catastrophic losses, while English casualties remained relatively low. Agincourt became a defining moment of the 100 Years' War, demonstrating how terrain, discipline, and ranged warfare could overturn overwhelming numerical superiority and reshape expectations of medieval combat. Battle of Tours. A turning point for Europe. In 732 AD, during the Umayyad expansion into Gaul, a Muslim army under Governor Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi advanced deep into Frankish territory, following earlier successes across the Iberian Peninsula and southern Gaul. Their objective was not just raiding pressure points, but extending influence further north into the Frankish domains. Facing this advance was Charles Martel, the de facto ruler of the Frankish kingdoms, who rapidly consolidated forces from across the region. The Franks positioned themselves on chosen ground near the route between Tours and Poitiers, an area that controlled access to key religious and economic centers. What followed was a prolonged engagement defined by discipline, terrain, and defensive formation. The Frankish infantry held a tight, static line, designed to absorb repeated cavalry assaults. The Umayyad forces, heavily reliant on mobility, attempted multiple charges to break the formation and force a collapse in the center. As pressure mounted, portions of the Umayyad army broke off during the fighting, reportedly reacting to threats against their camp and supplies. This fragmentation weakened coordination across the battlefield, disrupting the offensive structure of the advance. In the final phase of the engagement, Abd al-Rahman was killed, and command cohesion collapsed. The outcome was a Frankish victory. The Umayyad forces withdrew south, ending their northward expansion in Gaul. While the scale and interpretation of the battle remain debated by historians, it marked a clear halt to further penetration into Frankish territory and reinforced Charles Martel's authority across the region. The Battle of Tours remains a critical moment in early medieval European history, where a frontier conflict became a long-term boundary shift between two expanding worlds. Battle of Lepanto. Naval empires collide. In 1571, the Mediterranean became the stage for one of the largest naval confrontations of the early modern era, as a coalition of Christian maritime powers, known as the Holy League, moved to intercept the expanding Ottoman fleet during its campaign in the eastern Mediterranean. The Ottomans, having secured key positions across the region including Cyprus, projected naval power westward through a large, coordinated galley fleet. In response, Spain, Venice, and allied states assembled a combined force under Don John of Austria, aiming to halt further Ottoman maritime expansion. Both sides converged near the Gulf of Patras, off the coast of Lepanto. What followed was a tightly contested naval engagement defined by direct ship-to-ship combat. The Holy League deployed reinforced galleys and heavier artillery platforms, using coordinated formations to disrupt Ottoman maneuverability. As the fleets engaged, battle lines collapsed into close-range fighting, where boarding actions and cannon fire determined control of individual vessels. The confined nature of the clash limited tactical withdrawal and intensified the destruction across both fleets. As the fighting progressed, key Ottoman formations broke under sustained pressure, and command cohesion weakened across multiple squadrons. The loss of flagship leadership further destabilized the wider fleet structure, allowing the Holy League to gain operational control of the battlefield. The outcome was a decisive victory for the Holy League. A significant portion of the Ottoman fleet was destroyed or captured, marking a major symbolic and strategic setback for Ottoman naval dominance in the Western Mediterranean. While Ottoman maritime power would later recover, Lepanto stood as a critical moment in the balance of naval influence between Europe and the Ottoman Empire, where coordination, firepower, and alliance warfare reshaped control of the sea. Battle of Waterloo. The end of Napoleon. In June 1815, after escaping exile and reclaiming power in France during the period known as the 100 Days, Napoleon Bonaparte faced a rapidly forming coalition determined to end his rule once and for all. Two major forces moved to intercept him in Belgium, the Anglo-Allied army under the Duke of Wellington and the Prussian army under Field Marshal Gebhard von Blücher. Napoleon's strategy depended on striking these armies before they could fully unite. He moved quickly into Belgium, attempting to defeat them separately. Early engagements achieved limited success, but failed to deliver a decisive blow that would prevent their coordination. On June 18, 1815, the confrontation came at Waterloo. Wellington's forces took a defensive position on elevated ground, holding firm despite repeated French assaults. The battlefield conditions, worsened by heavy rain the night before, slowed French advances and disrupted artillery effectiveness, while delaying full deployment. As the battle progressed, French attacks failed to break the Allied center. Then, in the late afternoon, Prussian forces under Blücher arrived on the field, striking Napoleon's right flank and shifting the balance of the engagement. The French army, now facing pressure from two coordinated fronts, began to lose cohesion. The outcome was decisive. Napoleon's forces were forced into retreat, and the defeat marked the collapse of his restored rule. Within days, he abdicated for the final time and was exiled, ending more than a decade of Napoleonic dominance in Europe. Waterloo became the final turning point, where a long sequence of campaigns ended, and the political map of Europe was permanently reshaped. Battle of Gettysburg. Turning point of America. In July 1863, during the American Civil War, Confederate General Robert E. Lee launched an invasion into Union territory, advancing into Pennsylvania with the aim of forcing a decisive victory on Northern soil. Opposing him was the Union Army of the Potomac, now under the command of General George G. Meade, rapidly mobilizing to intercept the Confederate advance. The two armies converged near the town of Gettysburg, a strategic crossroads that quickly transformed into the center of one of the largest engagements of the war. Over 3 days of continuous fighting, both sides contested key terrain, ridges, hills, and fortified positions that shifted control of visibility, artillery advantage, and supply movement. Confederate forces attempted repeated assaults to break the Union lines, including coordinated attacks on both flanks and a concentrated final push toward Cemetery Ridge. The Union Army, holding defensive high ground and reinforced positions, absorbed these attacks while maintaining cohesion under sustained pressure. The decisive moment came on the third day, when a large-scale frontal assault, later known as Pickett's Charge, was launched against the Union center. The attack advanced across open ground under heavy fire and ultimately failed to break the defensive line, resulting in severe Confederate losses. The outcome was a Union victory. Lee's invasion was halted, and his army forced into retreat back toward Virginia. The defeat marked a critical shift in momentum for the Confederacy, ending its capacity to carry large-scale offensive operations into Northern territory. Historically, Gettysburg is regarded as a turning point of the Civil War, where the strategic initiative shifted, and the long trajectory of the conflict began to favor Union forces. Battle of Verdun. Endless trench warfare. In 1916, on the Western Front of World War I, German forces launched a deliberate offensive against the French fortress region of Verdun, an area chosen not for rapid breakthrough, but for prolonged attrition designed to exhaust the French army into collapse. The French command, recognizing Verdun's symbolic and strategic importance, committed to holding the position at all costs. What followed was not a conventional battle of movement, but a sustained industrial siege, artillery barrages, reinforced trench systems, and repeated assaults across heavily cratered ground. Entire sectors were reduced to rubble, with visibility, supply lines, and mobility continuously degraded under constant shellfire. As the German strategy unfolded, waves of infantry attacks were launched against fortified positions along the Meuse. The intent was to force France into a cycle of continuous reinforcement, drawing manpower into a prolonged grinding conflict. In response, French forces rotated divisions through the front, maintaining defensive cohesion despite extreme attrition and logistical strain. Over months of combat, neither side achieved a decisive breakthrough. Positions were taken and retaken, but the overall front line shifted only marginally, even as casualties mounted into the hundreds of thousands on both sides. The outcome was a French-held defensive victory. Verdun did not collapse, and the German offensive failed to achieve its strategic objective. However, the cost was staggering, one of the highest casualty totals of the First World War, leaving the battlefield itself transformed into a devastated industrial wasteland and a lasting symbol of attritional warfare on the Western Front. Battle of the Somme. A single day of massive loss. In 1916, during World War I, British and French forces launched a major offensive along the Western Front near the Somme River in France, aiming to break through entrenched German defensive lines and end the stalemate of trench warfare. The plan depended on a prolonged artillery bombardment followed by a coordinated infantry advance across open ground. However, German defensive positions, deep trenches, reinforced bunkers, and surviving barbed wire, remained largely intact, allowing machine gun positions to remain operational as attacking troops moved forward into exposed terrain. On July 1, 1916, the first day of the offensive, advancing British units faced immediate and concentrated defensive fire. Across the front, formations broke down under sustained resistance, resulting in catastrophic losses within hours of the attacks. As the battle continued over the following months, the fighting shifted into a prolonged war of attrition, with incremental territorial gains measured in meters rather than miles, as both sides absorbed repeated losses under continuous artillery and infantry engagement. The outcome was a prolonged Allied offensive that failed to achieve a decisive breakthrough. By the time it ended in November 1916, the battle had produced over 1 million total casualties across all sides, making it one of the deadliest engagements of the First World War and a defining example of industrial-scale warfare and attritional conflict. Battle of Midway. Naval turning point of World War II. In June 1942, during the Pacific Campaign of World War II, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched an operation aimed at capturing Midway Atoll and drawing out the remaining strength of the United States Pacific Fleet. The objective was decisive: eliminate American carrier forces and secure dominance across the Central Pacific. However, Japanese plans were compromised by Allied code-breaking efforts, which revealed the timing and direction of the attack. As a result, the U.S. Navy was positioned in advance, with carrier task forces lying in wait near Midway. What followed was a fast-moving naval air engagement defined by reconnaissance failures, split command decisions, and rapid carrier-based strikes. Japanese forces initially attacked Midway itself, but failed to neutralize its airfields. Meanwhile, American aircraft, launched from both Midway and U.S. carriers, began repeated strikes against the approaching Japanese fleet. The critical shift occurred when American dive bombers located exposed Japanese carriers during a vulnerable rearming phase. With flight decks crowded and aircraft being refueled and rearmed, the Japanese fleet was unable to respond in coordinated formation. Sustained air attacks resulted in multiple carrier losses in a short period of time, breaking the operational core of the Japanese strike force. The outcome was a decisive United States victory. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers and a significant portion of its experienced naval aircrew, halting its expansion across the Central Pacific. The United States, while also suffering losses, maintained its carrier capability and regained strategic initiative. The Battle of Midway is widely regarded as the turning point in the Pacific War, where intelligence, timing, and carrier warfare converged to shift the balance of naval power away from Japan and toward the United States. Battle of Stalingrad. The city that refused to fall. In 1942, during World War II, German forces launched a major offensive into the Soviet Union with the objective of capturing Stalingrad, a key industrial and transportation hub along the Volga River. Securing the city would sever Soviet supply routes and strengthen Germany's strategic position on the Eastern Front. The attack quickly escalated into one of the most intense urban battles of the war. Entire districts were reduced to ruins under continuous artillery bombardment and aerial strikes, transforming the city into a fragmented battlefield of rubble and defensive strongpoints. Soviet forces, under strict orders to hold the city, engaged in close-range combat where control shifted street by street, building by building. As the German Sixth Army pushed deeper into Stalingrad, its advance became increasingly constrained by destroyed infrastructure, stretched supply lines, and constant Soviet counterattacks from within the city. Meanwhile, Soviet command prepared a larger operational response targeting the weaker Axis flank surrounding the city. In November 1942, the Red Army launched a coordinated counteroffensive that struck Romanian and Allied positions north and south of Stalingrad. The operation succeeded in encircling the German Sixth Army, cutting it off from reinforcement and resupply. Attempts to break the encirclement or establish an external relief corridor ultimately failed under sustained Soviet pressure. The outcome was a decisive Soviet victory. In early 1943, the encircled German forces surrendered after months of attritional urban warfare and encirclement conditions. The Battle of Stalingrad became a turning point on the Eastern Front, marking the end of German strategic initiative in the Soviet Union and beginning a sustained Soviet advance westward that would continue until 1945. Battle of El Alamein. Africa's decisive clash. In 1942, during World War II, Axis forces under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel advanced across North Africa with the objective of breaking through Egypt and securing control of the Suez Canal, one of the most critical strategic routes in the Allied supply network. Facing them was the British Eighth Army, reorganized under General Bernard Montgomery, who prepared a heavily fortified defensive line near El Alamein. The battlefield itself was naturally constrained between the Mediterranean coast and the Qattara Depression, limiting Axis maneuverability and reducing the effectiveness of their mobile warfare doctrine. What followed was a prolonged and methodical confrontation. The Axis forces attempted repeated offensives to breach the defensive line, relying on armored thrusts and infantry assault supported by artillery. In response, Allied forces combined entrenched defensive positions with coordinated artillery fire and controlled counterattacks, gradually absorbing and wearing down the attacking formations. As the second phase of the battle unfolded in October 1942, Allied forces launched a large-scale offensive designed to break Axis defensive depth through concentrated pressure and attrition. Over several days of intense fighting, Axis lines began to fragment under sustained attacks, compounded by supply shortages and mounting losses. The outcome was a decisive Allied victory. Rommel's forces were forced into a long retreat across North Africa, and the Axis advance toward Egypt was permanently halted. The Battle of El Alamein marked a strategic turning point in the North African campaign, where control of terrain, logistics, and sustained pressure shifted the balance of the war in the Allies' favor and began the gradual collapse of Axis positions in the region. Battle of Normandy, D-Day. The largest invasion in history. In June 1944, during World War II, Allied forces launched Operation Overlord, an unprecedented amphibious assault aimed at breaking German control over Western Europe and opening a second front on the continent. The objective was direct but immense in scale: establish a secure foothold in Nazi-occupied France and begin the liberation of Western Europe. German forces had spent years fortifying the Atlantic Wall, a layered defensive system of bunkers, obstacles, artillery positions, and mined beaches stretching across the Normandy coastline. The Allies, under the overall command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, prepared a coordinated strike involving air, sea, and ground forces designed to overwhelm these defenses through simultaneous pressure across multiple landing zones. On June 6, 1944, the invasion began before dawn with airborne drops behind enemy lines, followed by a massive naval bombardment and the landing of infantry across 5 designated beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. The operation involved one of the largest assembled invasion fleets in history, with thousands of ships and aircraft supporting the assault across a 50-mile stretch of coastline. As troops came ashore, resistance varied sharply. Some sectors saw relatively rapid progress, while others, most notably Omaha Beach, became scenes of intense defensive fire, where German positions inflicted severe casualties and nearly halted the landing in its early stages. Despite these conditions, Allied forces gradually secured beachheads through sustained reinforcement and coordinated breakthroughs. By the end of the day, the Allies had established a foothold in Normandy. What began as a high-risk, multinational assault evolved into the opening phase of Western Europe's liberation, shifting the strategic balance of the war and forcing Germany into a prolonged defensive campaign on 2 major fronts. Battle of Kursk. The largest tank battle ever. In July 1943, during World War II on the Eastern Front, Nazi Germany launched Operation Citadel, an offensive aimed at cutting off the Soviet-held Kursk salient, a wide bulge in the front line that had become a heavily fortified Soviet defensive zone. The German plan depended on a coordinated pincer attack from the north and south, intended to encircle and destroy Soviet forces within the salient and regain strategic initiative after the defeat at Stalingrad. However, Soviet intelligence had already detected the buildup and prepared extensive layer defenses, minefields, anti-tank positions, artillery zones, and deep defensive belts designed to absorb and slow any armored advance. When the offensive began on July 5, 1943, German armored units advanced into heavily prepared Soviet defenses. Progress was slow and costly, with tanks repeatedly stalled by mines, artillery fire, and coordinated defensive resistance. Even when localized breakthroughs occurred, Soviet forces quickly reinforced threatened sectors and prevented operational collapse. By mid-July, the momentum had shifted. The Red Army launched large-scale counteroffensives, striking German formations and forcing them onto the defensive. One of the most significant armored clashes occurred near Prokhorovka, where concentrated tank engagements reflected the scale and intensity of the broader battle. The outcome was a decisive Soviet victory. German forces failed to achieve a breakthrough and were gradually pushed back, suffering heavy losses in armor and experienced personnel. Kursk marked the end of Germany's ability to conduct large-scale strategic offensives on the Eastern Front, with the initiative permanently shifting to the Soviet Union. The Battle of Kursk is widely regarded as the largest tank battle in history and a turning point in World War II, where planned offensive warfare gave way to sustained Soviet strategic dominance. What we have examined is not just a series of battles, but a sequence of turning points that redirected the course of entire civilizations. From ancient empires to modern global conflicts, each moment carried consequences that extended far beyond the battlefield. These were not isolated victories or defeats. They were structural shifts in power, strategy, and survival, where the outcome of a single confrontation reshaped borders, governments, and generations that followed. And while history often records the winners and the fallen, it rarely captures the full weight of what was truly changed in those moments. Thank you for watching this video. If you found this analysis valuable, consider subscribing for more documentary investigations into the events that shaped our world. Like and share the video to support the channel and help bring more in-depth historical content like this.